The farm near our house had a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin patch on Halloween. It was pretty cool to look at, a whole field filled with meticulously carved pumpkins with their grotesque faces glowing from the candlelight within. There was candy strewn about in little baggies, and kids of all ages visited either before or after they trick-or-treated to get some extra loot. We moved in across the street from that field a couple years ago. At first, we loved the idea of a jack-o'-lantern patch. It looked quite haunting and really spoke to the Halloween spirit in me and my wife. But when Halloween was over, the farmer didn't take the jack-o'-lanterns away. He left them to rot. Now, I assumed it was to fertilize the ground for whatever crop he'd plant in the spring. It made sense. He wouldn't want all that organic material to go to waste, right? The problem was they'd attract animals and bugs. In the unseasonably warm November we'd had last year, the smell of the rotting gourds brought critters from far and wide to the field. When they were done eating, they'd wander the neighborhood. Being a small town, there was little anyone could do to stop the farmer, whose name was Reuben, from doing whatever he wanted on his property. We had to deal with the deer and skunks and coyotes and foxes and flies and bees and bats, all eating and shitting and fucking their way across the town until no more pumpkins were left. Last year, I approached Reuben while he was setting up the jack-o'-lanterns. He was a friendly guy. There was never any doubting that. I explained the issue, and he listened and nodded. He said a few other people had told him the same thing, and he'd fixed the fences over the summer, so that wouldn't be a problem anymore. Besides, he told me with a smile, last year was just a test run. This Halloween, everything's going to be just perfect. On Halloween, the jack-o'-lantern field looked even better than it had the year before. Even though the arrangement was the same, Reuben had hired some artists to collaborate and create truly monstrous designs for the pumpkins. They were awesome. I even did a walkthrough by myself in the early afternoon before the candles were lit, just to take it all in. I felt like a kid again. As the evening was coming to a close, and we'd given out the majority of our candy to the neighborhood children, we were getting ready to turn off the light and lock up, when we heard sirens approaching. I looked outside and saw a procession of police cars and fire engines and ambulances heading toward us. I stepped out on the porch and watched as they passed our house and took the sharp left into the driveway of Reuben's farmhouse. I sat on the steps with my wife and watched as lights were flipped on and the field was partially illuminated. "Oh my God," I whispered. In the harsh overhead lights, I saw bodies on the ground among the glowing jack-o'-lanterns. Small ones. Small, costumed ones. Kids. "Oh my God," I repeated, louder. Paramedics and rescue officials descended on the field and worked to resuscitate the still bodies. One by one, they gave up. Parents were arriving in drones, and the sound of wailing and hysteria filled the air. My wife and I held one another as the little bodies with sheets over them were loaded into ambulances. The next morning, it was all over the news. 32 children dead in an apparent poisoning. Reuben was arrested and questioned. He refused to speak to the investigators and was held without bail. Funerals were held and pumpkins began to rot. It was another unseasonably warm November, and on cue, insects began to discover the field. Clouds of flies drifted in and out, blanketing the field in a gray haze as they left their eggs in the pumpkin's softening flesh. In the following days, toxicology reports on the autopsied children came back. Whatever had poisoned them was still unknown. They'd exhibited all the outward signs of a poisoning, cyanosis, hemorrhage, paralysis, etc., but no toxins were found in their bodies. Tissue samples were held for further testing, but the corpses were released to the families. 2 weeks later, the air was still thick with flies and bees. We still hadn't had a frost. Things that crawled and flew feasted on the pulpy remains of the jack-o'-lanterns. I could see their deformed, hideous faces from the house, faces which no longer evoked a feeling of holiday fun. They were faces that mocked the dead. The incredibly warm autumn continued, 20 degrees above average, according to the weatherman. Flowers were blooming, and the cherry trees had blossomed a full 5 months ahead of time. Pumpkins were still there, mostly formless, having succumbed to rot and the ravenousness of the vermin. As the hot November slouched into December, the luckiest of us started to forget about the tragedy that had befallen the town. But we still got reminders, especially on December 2nd, when Reuben broke his silence. And my cousin Ron works for the police department as a mechanic. He doesn't have any access to criminals or official information, but he talks to cops a lot. And the cops like to talk. Ron came over on the 2nd, before any news had gotten out about what Reuben was saying. It was clear he was uncomfortable. Lillian and I sat and listened while Ron relayed what his buddy had learned from the detective. The Reuben I knew was nothing like the man being described by my cousin. He'd blanketed himself with cuts and scars of indecipherable symbols and words. Every inch of his flesh was carved or mutilated in one way or another. Something he'd done with his fingernails over the course of the time he was in jail. The detectives learned that Reuben was ready to talk when he began to scream the names of each dead child. Just after midnight on the 2nd, he shouted each first, middle, and last name until his voice was hoarse. Detectives stood on the other side of his cell and transcribed what he said. They didn't understand most of it, but it was better than nothing. The main takeaway was a date and time. December 5th, 11 p.m. No one could figure out what he meant by it, so there was a lot of speculation. All the police could do was park a unit over by the farm overnight, just in case he had something planned. On the 5th, I sat with Lillian and Ron on the front porch and stared at the black field in front of us. 11 came. Nothing happened. We waited for a few minutes. I saw the cop across the street standing next to his car, smoking a cigarette. As we were getting ready to go inside, I saw something flicker in the field. A tiny flame. "Look," I told the others and pointed. They saw it too, and more flickers came into view. "Hey!" I yelled to the cop and kept pointing at the field. The cop snuffed out his cigarette and walked around the barn to take a look. He got to the side of the field, then raised his radio to call for backup. As we watched, the flickers intensified as if they were from new candles that had finally started properly burning their wicks after sputtering and threatening to go out. After only a couple minutes, more police cars arrived. I got up and started to cross the street. I needed to see what was going on. "Don't," said Lillian as she grabbed my hand, but I shrugged her off and headed toward the fence. I heard Ron walking behind me. The police arrived and lit up the field with their searchlights. We could see the rotten pumpkins sitting in the field, all with single candles sticking out of them. They were shaking. One by one, candles fell and hit the dry straw. The straw ignited. Police officers called for emergency assistance from the fire department, but there was no chance they'd get there in time. The fire began to rage. Entombed in flame, the rotten pumpkins started to burst. Only after their pulpy bodies had disintegrated did we see what was inside. "Oh my fucking God," Ron half whispered, half prayed. In place of each pumpkin, there was a small, human-shaped thing sitting with its head down and knees clutched to its chest. The heat intensified further and I backed up, but I still saw it all. One by one, the things rose on sturdy legs and stood erect. They were growing, and soon they'd reach the size of the children who died. Their skin began to char. They walked out of the flames and toward the crowd of police officers. Without any idea what to do, but terrified out of their minds, some began to shoot. The bullets did not stop them. Round after round tore through the fire-spawned children, exiting their backs and legs and heads in a geyser of gore. But they walked ever forward. Soon the officers who'd fired fell to the ground. They didn't move for a second, but then they just started to rot, just like the pumpkins. Other officers backed away. I backed up all the way to my house, and I watched from the doorway with my wife and cousin. We were horrified. A procession of children walked down the street, followed by the police cars. Firefighters worked to put out the blazing field, and after a little while, they'd succeeded. Ron turned on his police scanner, and we sat in the living room, listening with horror as news of dead cops and other officials came in.
The children have reached the prison. The children have burned through the cell of Ruben Rendell. The children are carrying Rendell back the way they came.
Oh, fuck, I said, and I opened the door, and they were coming back down the street. A procession of blackened, smoldering kids carrying a burning man. Ruben. And he was screaming. "It's almost done! It's almost finished!" He screamed with peals of hysterical laughter as he burned, and the children carried him to the field and placed him in the center. And they placed themselves in the same spots as the pumpkins from which they'd emerged. Most had gone out. Some still glowed with dull, red fire. Before Ruben burned to death, he unleashed one final scream. "Please accept this offering. Is this enough? Is this what you needed? See me through. See me through." There was no sound from him after that final word. Nothing but the crackling of dying flames. The following days were a whirlwind of investigations, media visits, and speculation. No one knew what happened. No one knew what Ruben had done, and for a while it was still a mystery how the kids had been poisoned in the first place. A mystery, that is. Until Jasmine McCrae, the mother of a child who was fortunate enough to have been too sick to trick or treat, found a small letter in her son's toy chest. It read, "For a special night of Halloween fun, draw this little picture on a piece of paper and swallow it. Then come to Farmer Ruben's pumpkin patch to trick or treat. You will never, ever want to leave." The picture was of an inverted star, a pentagram. Jasmine's son told her Ruben had given them to kids at recess one day after he talked to the classes about what it was like to be a farmer. He came to them individually and made them promise to throw it away after they read it and not to tell their parents. Jasmine gave the letter to the police and then told the media, while the superstitious residents of the town took that as an answer to what had happened. Skeptics like myself couldn't believe it, even after what I'd seen. I couldn't believe something supernatural had occurred. But then the photographs came in. The aerial photographs from the news helicopter the day after the Holocaust at the field. Clearly marked in carbon and ash was the shape of a pentagram. The exact shape the pumpkins had been arranged in. No one had noticed it from the ground. At the center of the pentagram, where Ruben had screamed his final, pleading prayer, 4 words were burnt into the dirt. The answer to the old farmer's prayers.
not enough. Never enough.